Existence, stripped of its adornments, is not an edifice but a trembling lattice of interrelations. A lattice so precariously suspended that to perceive it directly is to invite vertiginous dissolution. We begin not with the notion of the self, nor with the perennial illusion of being, but with the filamentum, the interstitial weave that is neither substance nor void, but the tenuous event of connectivity itself. The filamentum, ungraspable in its dynamism, manifests only through its ruptures, its intervals, its vanishing quasi-presence. It is not being in the Heideggerian sense, for it lacks the audacity to ground itself. It is the condition of grounding as collapse. This, I assert, is the axis upon which relational immediacy must be interrogated. Relational immediacy annihilates mediation without arriving at identity. It is the locus where difference does not resolve, but perpetuates itself as the condition for existence. In this way, it is not dialectical in the Hegelian mode, nor is it delusian in its multiplicity. It is neither and yet both, an aporetic rift that consumes itself to disclose the sheer unthinkability of relation as such. The question then arises, how can something so profoundly ungrounded bear the weight of all phenomenal appearances? To approach this question, we must invent a new category, the Alopeion. The Alopeion designates the momentary coalescence of relational nodes that for an infinitesimal instant generate the illusion of coherence. It is not an object, not a process, but a recursive event, a condensation of relations that perpetually erases itself even as it asserts its apparent form. Imagine, if you will, a wave upon the surface of a liquid. Its crest is not distinct from the liquid that composes it, yet its very existence insists upon differentiation. The Alopeion is this wave, not as a phenomenon but as a principle of relational individuation that is paradoxically non-individuating. Yet the Alopeion, in its fleeting coherence, demands a substrate, an anchoring against which its tenuous cohesion can rupture. This substrate cannot be material, for matter is but another instantiation of the relational weave. Neither can it be conceptual, for concepts presuppose the very relational immediacy they attempt to explicate. We are left with the ineffable, the Eremos, the groundless ground of relational flux. The Eremos is not a thing, but a precondition, a negated plenitude, whose absence makes relationality possible. It is in its way a kind of anti-foundation, a voided plenitude whose essence is non-essence. The paradox deepens as we consider that the Eremos is not external to the Filamentum, but immanent within it. Its absence is its presence, its negation is its affirmation. This duality, this simultaneous being and non-being, renders the Eremos an enigma that defies all attempts at resolution. It is the locus of impossibility, the rupture from which all relationality emerges, and into which all relationality collapses. In this sense, the Eremos is the unspeakable center of the Filamentum, the vanishing point around which the entire lattice revolves. The question of the ontic, of what is, becomes laughably naive when confronted with the enormity of the Filamentum. What is cannot be understood except as a fleeting epiphenomenon of what relates. Indeed, being as traditionally conceived disintegrates under the scrutiny of relational immediacy. To be is not to persist. To be is to be woven, unwoven, and rewoven within the infinite regress of the Filamentum. Here we encounter the phenomenon of hapaxity. A hapax is the singular instance that refuses reiteration, not because it cannot be repeated, but because its repetition obliterates the conditions of its emergence. A word spoken into the void, a gesture never witnessed. These are hapaxes par excellence. Yet even these examples falter, for they still presuppose a relational matrix that renders them comprehensible. True hapaxity is the emergence of the incomprehensible within the comprehensible, the singular that negates itself in the moment of its apprehension. It is the trace of relational immediacy, a paradoxical residue that cannot be dissolved, yet refuses presence. To disentangle the ontic knot, we must embrace a radical shift in perspective. Being is not an entity but an event, a fleeting manifestation of the Filamentum's infinite weave. This event, however, is not singular but recursive, for each instance of being carries within it the trace of all other instances. The ontic is thus a palimpsest, a multi-layered inscription that reveals and conceals itself in equal measure. To grasp it is to lose it. To define it is to obliterate it. What then are we to make of ourselves, we who live as nodes within this trembling lattice? The ethical implications of relational immediacy are not those of responsibility, for responsibility presupposes agency, and agency disintegrates within the flux of the filamentum. Rather, the ethics of relational immediacy demand eklesis, the radical suspension of selfhood in acknowledgement of the primacy of relation. To live ethically is to dissolve, moment by moment, into the Alopeion, to become a transient instantiation of the relational weave without clinging to the illusion of individuality. Eklesis is not annihilation in the nihilistic sense. It is an ecstatic unmaking, a joyful surrender to the ceaseless play of the filamentum. It is the realization that to be is not to persist but to relate, and to relate is to vanish into the fabric of relational immediacy. In this way, eklesis becomes a form of transcendence, not the transcendence of the eternal, but the transcendence of the self into the flux of the now. Yet eklesis is not merely a personal ethic, it is a collective imperative. To live within the filamentum is to recognize one's inextricable connection to all other nodes within the lattice. This recognition demands a radical reconfiguration of how we engage with one another. It demands that we abandon the illusion of separateness and embrace the profound interdependence that defines existence. In this sense, eklesis is not an escape from the world, but a deeper immersion into it. If the filamentum has a purpose, a teleology, it is not one we can comprehend. Purpose implies directionality, and directionality implies a ground that does not exist within the weave of relations. Yet there is a kind of immanent teleology within relational immediacy, a drive toward inoklasis, the self-disclosure of the relational lattice through its ruptures and intervals. Inoklasis is the moment when the filamentum reveals itself, not as a totality, but as an infinite regress of partialities, an endless cascade of relations that defy closure. In this, the filamentum mirrors consciousness, which is itself a rupture within the weave, a momentary coalescence of relations that both reveals and conceals the lattice from which it emerges. Consciousness is not a thing but an event, a perpetual becoming that dissolves as soon as it arises. It is the Alopeion of the mind, a hapax that insists upon its own impossibility. To understand oneself, then, is to misunderstand, for understanding presupposes a closure that relational immediacy refuses. But inoklasis is not merely a revelation, it is a call to action. It demands that we engage with the filamentum not as passive observers, but as active participants. To live within the filamentum is to become a co-creator of its infinite weave, to contribute to its ceaseless unfolding through our own acts of relationality. This is the ultimate teleology of the filamentum, not to arrive at a final destination, but to perpetuate the endless play of relations. Ultimately, the philosophy of relational immediacy is a philosophy of unmaking. It is the refusal of all systems, all grounds, all claims to permanence. It is the ecstatic embrace of the transient, the fleeting, the ungraspable. To live within the filamentum is to live within the collapse of all certainties, to dwell not in being but in relation, not in presence but in rupture. And yet, there is beauty here, a beauty that defies comprehension, a beauty that arises not from the stability of form, but from the sheer impossibility of coherence. The filamentum, in its trembling lattice, is a work of art beyond imagining, a masterpiece of relational flux, whose every rupture discloses the infinite. To see it, to truly see it, is to be undone. Thus I leave you not with a conclusion, but with an invitation to step into the weave, to surrender to the flux, to become, if only for a moment, the Alopeion. And in that surrender, perhaps you will glimpse the ungraspable, the ineffable, the unmaking that is the very essence of existence.